Throughout human history, all manner of cultural or religious practices have been developed. Some are benevolent acts of charity, piety, or devotion, but some can be truly horrific. One such disturbing practice is that of Sati, a practice that took place on the Indian subcontinent. It involved the sometimes voluntary, sometimes coerced, and sometimes forced Hindu widow joining her deceased husband on the funeral pyre, where she would be burned alive. In today's video, we will cover the origins of the practice, how it was carried out, and how it was ultimately banned. It is perhaps helpful to start with the origins of the practice in the Hindu religion and culture. The practice of Sati is not mentioned in the early Vedic texts, nor in the Dharma Sutras. The term Sati is derived from the Hindu goddess Sati, who self-immolated in response to a humiliation carried out by her father against her husband Shiva. The first recorded instance of Sati can be traced to 510 BC. There exists inscriptions detailing how a king's wife had put herself upon her husband's funeral pyre. Whilst it is not mentioned in the early texts, Sati would be adopted by later Hindu texts, such as the Parashara Smriti. There it was emphasized that a good Hindu widow would either live a life of ascetic existence or put herself on her husband's funeral pyre. This voluntary element was seen as vital, yet coercion and force would soon be used to ensure the widow self-immolated. If the practice was not a founding tenet of Hinduism, one must look to other reasons as to why the practice developed. One possible explanation looks to the practice of Johar. This is where the female members of the Rajput caste, the caste commonly associated with warriors, would commit self-immolation ahead of their husbands dying in battle. These acts were done typically where the battle was known to be lost, and would be a way for the women to avoid capture, humiliation, and essay carried out by the victorious enemy. It is thought that such a practice could have inspired the higher Brahmin caste to start the practice of Sati, or in some way inspire its development. It was seen as an act of devotion to one's husband and a way to preserve one's honor. In all likelihood, the cultural beliefs around the practice of Sati were used to support the notion that widows were lesser. There were a number of restrictions put in place on the practice of Sati, such as a woman who was menstruating or had children to raise. In these cases, they would not be expected to commit Sati. There were some Hindu scholars who opposed the practice, stating that a person should live their full, natural life, and that it should not be taken earlier than what was ordained. Others put in place prohibitions just on the higher Brahmin caste of women, but content for lower castes to throw themselves into fires. Both Muslims and Sikhs would not generally take part in Sati. Once the Mughals rose to power, there were attempts to, if not right out ban, then to curtail the practice of Sati. In the early 1500s, Mughal Emperor Humayun attempted to ban the practice for all women above child-rearing age, as this was the group most likely to partake. He also sought to control the practice with a requirement for licenses approving self-immolation. However, in practice, these licenses were readily issued, and Sati continued unabated. Humayun's son would expand on his father's work, banning Sati along with other reforms, such as allowing widows to remarry and increasing the age for marriage. In the 1600s, further steps were made to prevent the practice, though some Sati continued thanks to corrupt officials bribed to turn a blind eye. Nevertheless, in areas controlled by the Mughals, instances of Sati were relatively rare, usually carried out by the wives of high-ranking Rajas and amongst the poorer of society. A number of foreign visitors noted both seemingly voluntary and involuntary instances of Sati being carried out. There were reports of women being made to lie on funeral pyres, weighed down with logs or tied with rope before being set alight. Opium and marijuana were sometimes used as pain relief or as a means of stupefying the widow, ensuring her compliance. Some accounts detail how often the women would attempt to leap from the pyre, often met with violence or being placed back upon the flames. Some accounts detailed the fates of women who refused to climb onto the pyre, that usually being of social exclusion, punishments to humiliate, and even death by other means. When European colonial powers moved into the region, many sought to ban sati. The French and Dutch sought to ban it in the territories they held, whilst the British and Portuguese tolerated the practice for a time. In the example of the British East India Trading Company, there was a general policy of not interfering with local cultural or religious practices. But where the company held more power, such as in Calcutta, in the late 1700s, sati was banned. In 1813, the British sought to distinguish legal and illegal forms of sati. This distinction was based upon whether the widow had consented or had been forced into joining her husband on the fire. Such a system required officials to observe and note signs of consent or coercion, likely a very difficult task. Between 1815 and 1828, a total of 8,134 cases of sati were recorded, most of which were among upper caste Hindus. As Christian missionaries developed their place within India, some sought to join with Hindu reformists to get rid of sati once and for all. Two of the leading reformists were Raja Ram Mohan Roy and William Carey. Mohan Roy had witnessed the immolation of his sister at a young age, dragged and forced onto the pyre. He worked with missionary William Carey on a number of reformations, crusading against sati, child marriage, and the wider caste system. In 1829, Lord William Bentinck, the first Governor-General of India, oversaw a ban on the practice of sati, listening to the petitions from Carey and Mohan Roy. Bentinck was quoted as saying upon his arrival into Calcutta that he felt a great responsibility for dealing with the practice of sati. Whilst there were fears of revolt for the British seeking to ban the custom, Bentinck proceeded and would expand the ban from Calcutta to Bombay and Madras in the coming years. There were those who opposed the reforms, notably Hindu conservatives eager to uphold the customs. Some appealed to the Privy Council, but Mohan Roy organised a counter-petition and successfully confirmed the ban in 1832. Other Indian princely states soon followed suit and enacted their own bans, though it was not until 1861 that it was banned in all. In 1837, however, the laws banning sati were relaxed. Rather than a complete ban, Thomas Macaulay wrote into the Indian Penal Code that those who lit the pyre at the widow's instance would not face a murder charge. Macaulay appeared to have a sympathetic view of the practice, commending the widow's strong sense of duty and religious honour. Whilst the practice was deemed all but abolished and no longer posing a threat to the women of India, it did not mean there were not cases of sati. Perhaps the most shocking and the last known case took place in 1987. Rup Kanwar was an 18-year-old woman and married for just 9 months when her husband died. She reportedly committed sati willingly immediately after her husband's death. Other reports hint to her being forced to climb the pyre, with those who witnessed the event turning hostile to the subsequent investigation into her death, and that Kanwar was held in a shed before being dragged to the pyre. 45 people were investigated, yet none faced any charges for her death. What did follow was the Sati Prevention Act, passed by India in 1987. This consolidated and criminalized the practice of sati, as well as making it a crime for those who glorify the act. Although some reported cases of sati do crop up occasionally, sati is a cruel practice. Societal and familial pressures combined with a religious justification for a way to treat widows as little more than an extension of her husband, with little value after his death. This practice was open to exploitation. Some would use it to get rid of the widow, so the family of the husband could keep the inheritance. Whilst many attempts were made to deal with the practice, it was Lord Bentinck, Mohan Roy, and Carey's efforts that were perhaps most meaningful. It is often the case that outside influences or colonial forces can seek to impose their own values on another group. Very often, these acts seek to wipe clean language, cultures, or beliefs, and homogenize the population. But where a practice involves the forced or coerced immolation of a widow, where there are those fighting to reform society and to make it more equitable, such impositions can only be seen as a benefit. To cling to harmful traditions can lead to much suffering. And whilst there is plenty to condemn the British Empire for, The part it played in attempting to rid India of the practice of sati ought to not be forgotten, nor should the widows who met their end upon the pyre be forgotten, victims of a society who saw them as without value after their husband's death, merely a possession to be burned alongside.